True story. 8 years ago, I ordered a custom bow from a reputable bow manufacturer all the way across the country. We talked a couple times, talked about woods and styles, and then we settled on what I was looking for, gave him my specs, and paid my down payment. 7 months later, the bow was ready. I paid in full. He shipped me the bow. I hated it the minute it came out of the box. It didn't look good. It didn't feel right. And it didn't shoot good. I ended up selling that bow 3 weeks later for $250 less than I paid for it. I took a bath on that, and my wife was not happy. Enter Blackwidow Bows. They have a test drive program. If you're even remotely interested in shooting a Blackwidow bow, give those guys at the shop a call. Talk to them. Tell them what you're looking for. They're going to give some really good guidance. They're going to have some really great advice. They're going to have a bow that's close to your specs on the demo rack, if not right on. You're going to run your card. You're going to pay for shipping both ways. You're going to pay for insurance both ways, and you're going to get to shoot the bow for a week. You might decide you don't want to shoot a Blackwidow bow, and that's cool. Send it back. But you might decide you want to order one. You want to make some tweaks to get it just what you want. I wish I had that option 8 years ago. If you're thinking about a Blackwidow bow, give those guys a call. If nothing else, they're fun to talk to. Oh yeah. Is it September yet? Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome to this week's episode of the Stickbow Chronicles, brought to you by the Blackwidow Bow Company. I'm Rob Patuto, and I have a puppy attacking me. So if you hear something weird, my dog is mauling me. Anyways, yeah, hey, cool episode this week. Super easy one for me to record. A lot of times these episodes we do, right? So I got to do a lot of thinking. It's really heavy. But this one I really enjoyed. It's easy. It's talking history with Gene Hopkins. Now, I can picture Gene's name because I've seen it through the years in various magazines. Gene is a historian. And when I talked to him originally on the phone, I feel like I'm pretty well versed in the, the players and what happened, kind of through the 50s, 60s and beyond, the Fred Bear, the Glenn St. Charles. But Gene takes it further back than that, and he was coming up with names that I had never heard of, and he explained some of the players whose names I've heard of, but I really didn't know the roles they played. So I think you guys will enjoy this. I think it's important to keep this, as Gene says, keeping the spirit alive. We have so many new people coming in. It's just good refresher, and maybe we'll have a quiz at the end of the week. It should be required listening. We'll have a quiz. Anyways, going to get you on out of here, get you right on to the episode. I want to say thank you to the companies that make this possible. The Footed Shaft, Kifaru International, Selway Archery, and of course, Blackwidow Bows. Support those that support us. Reach out and even if you're not going to order anything, just say, hey, thank you for supporting the Stickbow Chronicles. We like what they do. Great community. That's all I got. Enjoy the show. Roger out. Gene Hopkins, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you, sir?
Pretty good. Pretty good. Sun's setting here. These short days just kill me. But,
yeah. Well, you've still got the sunshine. It's been dark here for a couple of hours, but so I always tell my Western friends, I'll have daylight before you do, so that makes up for it.
And I tell all of my buddies over in Australia that I talk to, like, hey, tell me what the lottery numbers are tomorrow. I'll split the money.
Did that ever work for you?
No, I don't think that. They won't give them to me.
Yeah.
So where are you?
I'm located in southern Indiana.
Southern Indiana.
About an hour south of Indianapolis, about an hour north of Louisville, Kentucky.
You still got some hunting season going on?
Yeah. Our hunting season will go through January 3rd.
Wow.
Our black powder season comes in this this weekend, but archery season runs from October 1st until this year, January 3rd.
Wow. Do you can you bow hunt during the black powder?
Yeah, you can bow hunt anytime between October 1 and January 3 during the general firearms season, during the black powder season. You can always take your bow and arrow out.
Nice. Well, cool. I see your name in print often, and I'm trying to figure out, is it just Traditional Bowhunter Magazine? What magazines am I seeing your name in?
Well, I've done some things in Bowhunter Magazine, here and there. I'm not a prolific writer, but I'm nearing my retirement. And as I think about retirement, I think, what I would like to, not because it's lucrative by any stretch, that you don't make money by writing, but I enjoy it. I enjoy writing, and I enjoy hunting. I enjoy the bow and arrow. I enjoy the history of archery. So I've talked to several people. I've talked to TJ and Robin about doing some more frequent articles for their Traditional Bowhunter Magazine, and Jeff Waring for Bowhunter Magazine wants me to do some articles for him. And they're coming into their 50th anniversary this year. So we want to do an article about the history of archery and maybe the history of archery magazines for their 50th anniversary edition.
Yeah, that would be super interesting.
Yeah.
I got a chance to talk to MR James. I had him on the podcast. I don't know if it was a year ago, maybe. And it was one of my highlights because I grew up just devouring Bowhunter Magazine. It was just, it's like, I think that was the only reason why I passed, reading in like 6th grade, because, but it was
that Bowhunter Magazine was started in Indiana.
Oh yeah, you're right. Dadgum. In
Fort Wayne, Indiana, 1972. Right?
Yeah. Does he still live there? Does MR still live there?
He does. He moved back here after, he made a little bit of money and moved out west and lived for several years out west. And now he's back just about an hour south of me in southern Indiana. It's
funny, when I first contacted him, he came off as kind of grouchy, and, it's not, I don't enjoy cold calling people. So I was like really on my heels. And I think I talked to him twice before the podcast. And I was kind of on my heels like, man, I'm not sure this guy is going to be much fun to talk to. And I had Aaron on. I thought it was going to be a good mix because, Aaron kind of being a new guy and MR James, with the history. And the minute we started, he was so engaging and so enjoyable to talk to. I had a blast. It was one of my favorite podcasts.
Oh, you can see probably a switch. I've seen both of those MRs because he's kind of a deep guy, right?
Yeah.
So sometimes he gets deep in thought and, comes off that way. And then you'll see a switch and his eyes just kind of twinkle. And then he gets into that creative MR James. And that's fun to be around when he's in that mode.
Oh, I thoroughly enjoyed it. And, for a magazine coming on their 50th year, what they've had three editors, right? Him, Dwight, and Kurt.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what stellar guys. I mean, all, Dwight Shue, man, salt of the earth, awesome guy. I had an opportunity to spend some time with him on a few different occasions. I have a friend that's guided Kurt Wells and said, what a great guy he is. So it's pretty awesome.
Well, a lot of us owe a lot to that magazine, MR and the other guys that started that magazine with him. We can all say that that's really what got us out there in the woods. We may have been shooting a bow and arrow. We may have been, exploring, tinkering with the ideas, but all those articles from all those early authors and those early magazines, early years of Bowhunter Magazine, really put a lot of us into the woods.
Absolutely. I mean, just kind of stoke the fire, right? As a 10, 12, 13-year-old kid, I had the ember there. I didn't have anybody to mentor me. So I just poured over those. I can still vividly see some of the articles in there and the authors.
Yeah, I think we're, I was born in 1958, so we must be, similar in age. But we grew up in an era where, there were some archery magazines, but they were more dedicated to target archery and field archery. The hunting magazines had more or less come and gone. and Bowhunter came in just at the right time to fill that void. We didn't have all the videos and all the DVDs and all the educational opportunities, YouTube and such that people do today. We were on our own. We learned this sport on our own. Hard knocks.
Absolutely.
And, we made a lot of mistakes. We didn't even know we were making mistakes.
One of my favorite stories to tell, like to tell people like how the learning curve was for me personally. I went down to the hardware store and bought a Bear bow sight. So it was like this, like an 1/8 inch steel bracket with these humongous brass pins.
Yeah.
And I put them on the bow, and I thought that your arrow, that was become the arrow rest. Like your arrow. Dude, I am so fortunate. I have my sight today.
I haven't heard that one before. I'm going to give you credit for that one.
I have my sight today, my vision, because I never released the string on that. Like, this ain't going to work.
I borrowed a Bear recurve from my uncle when I was probably 6 years old. I didn't know any different. I went around for 2 weeks shooting that thing with it strung backwards. Until somebody finally pointed it out to me. And, I was so young and so small, and I couldn't string it. So when they finally showed me the right way to do it, I had to have somebody else string it.
Yeah, I don't think it's a school of hard knocks. I think we deserve the University of Hard Knocks. A college degree in hard knocks.
Yeah, and I guess, we're not ashamed to admit our mistakes, but we made a lot of them.
Yeah, and I'll mention, I'll build on that. Today, you talk about YouTube and all the podcasts and all the DVDs and all the information. The learning curve is so short these days, but, there's so much enjoyment lost in that big, long curve that a lot of us did.
It took me 11 years to take my first deer with a bow and arrow. From the day I seriously started trying to hunt and kill a deer with a bow and arrow here in Indiana. I started in 1970. It was my first year to try to kill a deer seriously with a bow and arrow. It was 1981 before I really killed a deer with a bow and arrow.
Yeah.
Now, how many people today would do that? How many, this era of instant gratification and competition with video games and everything that kids and young people are dealing with today would spend 11 years before they got put in quotes here, were successful?
Yeah.
But it wasn't about killing a deer. It was about learning. It was about doing it. It was about trying to figure it out. That's what drove us.
And how much more satisfaction do you get, the accomplishment after 11 years, as opposed to, maybe 2 years? I had a guest on the podcast one time. I think it was a guest. I talked to so many people. Anyways, this person sheepishly told me that they had, it took them 4 years to kill their first deer with traditional equipment. I was like, man, that's nothing.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. I mean,
he should write a book.
That's funny. No, it is. And I do believe that we collectively, have, brought back some of that, getting people to understand that it is about the journey, right? It's not, I think that is appreciated more. Actually, I think that's appreciated more in traditional archery in the younger crowd today than it was, say, 8 years ago.
I do see the pendulum swinging. You're right.
Yeah. I think people understand that, like, wow, this is about trying to do this with this bow, and it's hard. And when I do it, it's going to be great. I do think we've made some headway.
I give credit to things like traditional Bowhunter magazine, and some of the YouTube videos out there that are not about the kill. They're about the hunt. They're about the experience. They're about the journey. And Glenn St. Charles was one of my heroes, probably my number one hero over the years. And one of the things that Glenn taught me and told me many, many, many times was, I'm not out there to kill something. I'm out there for a walk in the woods. And if I happen to have a successful day, bringing home an animal, that's just gravy. But so I had Jay, his son, make me a bow several years ago, and he names his bows as you would expect, and he says, "What do you want me to name this bow?" And I said, "A walk in the woods." That's what your dad always taught me.
Yeah.
So I have one of Jay's bows named A Walk in the Woods in tribute to Glenn.
That's awesome. You know, we're firing right down the road, right off the bat here. Glenn is. I love the bear history. I love Fred Bear history. I love talking about Fred Bear and all that. But Glenn St. Charles to me was more. I might get burned at the stake for this, but he seemed to be like more of a pure hunter. And now that's just my opinion, and I'm only saying that because like Fred Bear was he was the ultimate entrepreneur. You know, it seemed like he was out there building his brand, building his product, where Glenn was just a little more steeped in the, you know, let's create bow hunting. I could be off base. That's the way I see it.
I think you're totally right. I mean, you know, you go back to Fred's, you know, the roots of Fred Bear when he met Art Young in the movie theater in Detroit, and I think it was 1927 when Art was going around and showing his movie in the movie theaters, and Art would personally be at those shows, and after the movie would be played, Art would come out and shoot his bow and arrow and take questions from the audience. And Fred Bear was in the audience there in Detroit when Art came, and that's how Fred was introduced to the sport of hunting with a bow and arrow. And so Fred understood and saw. He was a visionary. He was a marketing guy. He was a genius in marketing. He saw pretty quickly by the early 1930s, he was already figuring out, how am I going to make a living out of the sport? And you can see he did. You know, he had a pretty successful career marketing and building the Bear Archery Company to be one of the premiers in the sport of archery. But here's Glenn, who is just as interested in this hunting with the bow and arrow. But Glenn is more interested in hunting with the bow and arrow than he is making a living with bow and arrow. Yes, he had Northwest Archery. Yes, he made his living selling, but he didn't make his living building bows and, you know, designing and making bows. He made in 1953 the Thunderbird bow. And that's the bow that Jay is now reproducing on the same forms that Glenn was using. But you know, that bow, 1953 Thunderbird, with the working recurve limbs, was so successful. Glenn went to Fred and said, you know what, Fred, there's too many, I've got too many orders. I can't keep up. It's taking away from my time in the woods. You should make a working recurve bow. And then Fred came out in 1954 with the Kodiak 2. So Glenn, you're absolutely, I think, spot on. That, you know, Glenn was more interested in hunting with the bow and arrow, and he made money from the sport of archery, but he used that money to go hunting. Fred was building his empire and building his business and building his legacy, different people.
Yeah. You know, and it's not, for me personally, it's not taking away anything from Fred, because, you know, we owe so much to him. But I do find it funny when people seem to put him up on a pedestal, you know, like, you know, about his hunting and about his, you know, his philosophy and stuff. And it's like, man, he's a businessman, you know?
he was definitely a businessman. I'll tell you a story. You know, I was a bear archery dealer in late 70s through the 80s back here in Indiana. And, you know, Fred was still alive. And I'd grown up seeing Fred Bear on the American Sportsman and reading Fred Bear articles in all the magazines. And, you know, yes, I did idolize Fred Bear, rightfully so. And I got the chance to meet Fred Bear for the first time in the early 1980s over in Middletown, Ohio. And so I go over to Middletown. I was at a big tournament, and I get there like 3 hours early because Fred Bear is going to be here, and he's going to be meeting people, and he's going to be signing books, and there's going to be 1,000 people in line. You know, this is in my mind, this is how this is going to play out. And I get there like 3 hours early because I want to be the first one in line. And there's nobody in the tent. And so, okay, that's all right. I sit down and I get ready for Fred to show up. And about an hour before he's supposed to start signing books and meeting people, this old brown car pulls up, and I expected a chauffeur-driven limousine. You know, it's Fred Bear. And this old brown car pulls up, and the driver's side door opens, and Fred unfolds himself out of this little car. This is Fred Bear. He's driving himself, and he's driving an old brown car here.
What a shame.
And he comes in and he sits down with me, and I'm the only guy in the tent.
Wow.
And we sit and we talk for It was almost an hour. And then people started lining up. And he looked at his watch and he looked at the line of people and he looked at me and he said, well, I guess it's time to go to work. And he got up and he went over and started meeting people and signing bows and signing books. And that's, that was Fred. There was two Freds. There was the Fred who was the genuine Fred Bear, who wanted to sit there and talk and wanted to talk about hunting and wanted to talk about life, just like you and I would. And then there was this Fred Bear that had to go to work.
Yeah. I have a very good friend of mine. It was an earlier podcast, maybe a year and a half ago. He lives over in Libby, Montana, Rich Yort, and he's steeped in history. He's got to meet a lot of cool people. He spent a couple hours in a motel room shooting the breeze, him and his buddy with Fred Bear. And he said, one of the first things he said is, man, that dude was a chain smoker. He was lighting one cigarette off the other.
Yes. But everything you hear about Fred was, if you never had the chance to meet Fred, everything you hear about Fred was true. He was just the most humble, gentle man you'll ever meet in your life. And he had a spirit you could feel when he walked in the room, a charisma, a spirit, whatever you want to call it. And yes, he was a marketing genius. Yes, he was a businessman, but the real Fred Bear was a real humble gentleman.
And what an awesome time in our country's history, in the 40s and 50s when he was coming up through. One of my favorite stories was, I read in one of his books about him taking apart a motorcycle all the way down to the smallest part, and then just putting it back together to know how it worked. It was like, wow. I mean, it's just a different world then.
It was a simpler world. And, having grown up in the 60s, it was, the 60s were simple compared to where we are today. Can you imagine how much more simpler the 40s would have been than even the 60s?
Oh, man. Let's back up just a little bit. I knew you said, how long is this going to, how long are you thinking? An hour? And I'm like, buddy, once we start talking, this is going to go.
I have nowhere to be.
Yeah, good deal. I've got some white-tailed tenderloins waiting for me to cook. So,
well, I have some blacktails. I just got back from Alaska, so
that's
I've got some fresh blacktail.
There you go. You as a kid there in Indiana, how did you get started hunting? What was your catalyst? Do you have any mentors?
When I tell people that I think it's genetic. The people that really have that drive, that passion, that fire for hunting. I think there's something genetic in us. So I grew up. My dad was born and raised during the Depression. He was born in 1932 in the Harlan County, Kentucky. And if you don't know Harlan County, Kentucky, that is the poorest county in this country, and especially during the Depression. And so Dad, there wasn't any money for them to have a rifle and 22 ammunition and any kind of things to go hunting with. And if they had, everybody else was starving to death too. So any squirrels, rabbits, or deer, somebody else had already killed and eaten them. So he didn't have any hunting background or knowledge or even desire. And then he went off to the Marines in 1951 and went to Korea. Ooh. And when he came back from Korea, he just, he's didn't have any use for firearms and didn't have any interest in that at all. But my mother, she grew up in farm country, Indiana, and her family they were hunters. So believe it or not, it was my mom that took me out when I was 5 and 6 years old, and we would go hunting. And then Indiana, we started getting deer in enough of a population of white-tailed deer that we could start hunting white-tailed deer. And it was my mom who took me out late 60s, early 70s to go on deer hunting. So that's how I got started. And then from there, I'd get up on Saturday morning and watch the American Sportsman with Kurt Gowdy and just hope that Fred Bear and Glenn St. Charles and Fess Parker would be on, and, read all the magazines and look at all the old herders catalogs. And I just couldn't get enough of it.
Oh man, I think there's 10 years between us, but it's kind of the same thing. I mean, you just for me, it was Bowhunter Warehouse, this this catalog that was like the cheapest paper you could possibly get, and I would just pour over it and
Yep.
Bowhunter magazine,
Yep.
and just drinking it all in. Then you go out in the woods and just roam around and try to shoot stuff. Oh gosh.
Yeah, there wasn't anybody that I knew in my circle of kids at that time that had a bow and arrow except me and Dave Willoughby. And I still hunt with Dave Willoughby today.
Oh, you're kidding. That's awesome.
Yeah, and he was my first friend in the first grade in school, and we hunted with a bow and arrow as long as I can remember. I can't remember a time in our lives when we didn't have a bow and arrow and we weren't out going shooting rabbits or squirrels or something, And 2 weeks ago, we went to Alaska black-tailed deer hunting, and we're still hunting together.
Oh man, that's I mean, to have that connection, to have somebody share all that with is awesome. My kind of the same thing. I never had anybody as a kid growing up, and then passing on. I moved a long ways away, but I talked to Toby at Blackwidow, and him and his brother. They have that connection growing up, and yeah, he's so fortunate to have somebody to share that with, and that's awesome. So how did we start into this collecting and preserving history? Tell me a little bit about that. What kind of spurred that on?
I've always been a history buff. Maybe I was a bit of a nerd.
You and me both. I still am.
I enjoyed history. I was pretty good at math, and I was really good at English and writing. But what I found most enjoyment in was history. And then as I, got into my teens, I started, people would call it today collecting, but I didn't know it was collecting. I started saving things. This is cool. I'm going to keep this. And then I opened an archery store, retail archery store here in Indiana, late 70s. And I would have people come in. We were good. We knew what we were doing, and people appreciated the fact that they could come to our store and we knew bows and arrows. So we had people driving from all over coming to buy archery equipment from us. But then I started noticing the trend, and this was probably mid 80s. I was having more and more people coming in the night before bow season and buying an arrow and want to buy an arrow and a broadhead. It's serious. This is serious. and there's something changing here. You should have been a year ago buying an arrow and a bow and a broadhead and been out practicing, and now you're coming in the night before season and you want an arrow and a broadhead and you're going to go to the woods tomorrow morning. So I started bowhunter education. I found out about this thing called National Bowhunter Education Foundation, and I found Bill Wadsworth, and I got a hold of Bill Wadsworth, and Bill Wadsworth said, coincidentally, we're looking for a new state chairman in the state of Indiana for our program, and would you like to be that? So I became state chairman for Bowhunter Ed here in Indiana in 1983, 4, 5, something. And as a part of my Bowhunter Ed program, I spent a lot of time talking about the history of bow hunting. Because I believe, that's, as bow hunters, we really like the tradition. We really like, it's not about killing, it's about hunting. It's about the campfire. It's about the friendships, all those things. So I would, in that history of bow hunting segment, I would always ask people, how many people in here have heard of Fred Bear? Oh, yeah. And in 1984, 1985, Fred was still alive, and just about everybody would raise their hands. Then Fred passed in 1988. And then I started to see in my classes, fewer and fewer people would raise their hand when I would ask, do you know who Fred Bear was? To the point where in some classes, you may only have 1 or 2 people raise their hand by the mid-90s. So I had been saving, I had been collecting, I had been admiring all this history, but then it hit me that we've got to do something to keep the spirit alive. We've got to keep the history, the legacy, the effort, all the accomplishments of, Fred Bear and Howard Hill and Morris Thompson, Will Thompson, and all these guys, we've got to do something to make sure they're not forgotten. And the contributions of these people for the sport that we means so much to us today, we've got to keep that alive. So that's when I really started getting more active. I had a collection, I had a good collection, but I started getting more active in promoting the history of our sport and going around and doing seminars and setting up at State Bowhunting Association banquets, or the PBS banquet, this past banquet, doing a seminar on the history of bow hunting. I call it keeping the spirit alive. That's I guess where I'm at now. And, I want to do these magazine articles, and I want to, my Facebook blog I've got out there on archery collecting. I just want to share with people what these guys did and their contributions, and, again, keep their spirit alive.
And I don't think there's any, excuse me, I don't think there's any better time for that than right now. I mean, with this tsunami of interest in traditional bow hunting, it's ripe, or the conditions are right to interject, the history. There's people that, I work with that, I mentioned Glenn St. Charles or Fred Bear, and you just get a deer in the headlight stare, and it's so foreign to me. It's like,
yeah, my mouth drops,
yeah.
My jaw drops to the ground when that happens, and how can that be?
Yeah, but we really, there's times where you really have to step back and think, man, a lot of these people never lived without cell phones. It's just a different world. But conveying the the importance of how we got to where we are, and about these. This is a big one for me. Is these seasons weren't about management. These seasons were never about game management. It was about opportunity. Yeah, exactly. And that's a whole nother discussion. But to keep this long and great seasons that we have, we gotta keep our history at the forefront and remember why we got what we have and how hard those people work to get it.
I'll tell you a quick story. We know that, but as late as the early 1990s, we had never been able to hunt our state parks here in Indiana, gun, bow, or anything, and the deer had overpopulated our state parks to the point where it looked like a bulldozer had gone through the parks from the over browsing. And we finally got the state of Indiana Department of Natural Resources. They were interested in controlling the deer herds in these state parks. And we, as the bow hunting community, and I was president of the Indiana Bowhunters Association during that period, we're going to DNR and saying it's great, but we need to get these parks hunted. It's okay, let's open them up for firearms hunting, but we want a park to be able to hunt with a bow and arrow. And they said, this is 1990s, and these are park management people, not fish and wildlife management people. And DNR's got a lot of different parts to it, right? It's not all fish and wildlife. Some of the parks people were saying, yeah, that's great, but bows and arrows are not that effective at killing a deer. And we've been doing it for a long time, right? So we convinced them to give us one park. Give us one park and let us have 1 year and let us try it. And they did. They gave us one park and they said, we'll give you 1 year, but, we're going to watch it. And we're going to be really, really watching to see if there's what the wound loss rates are going to be, how the bow hunters conduct themselves and all this stuff. And I don't know how they were really skeptical about it. The same thing that our forefathers had gone through back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. We're repeating this in the 90s. We had to reprove ourselves. And we did. We went into that state park and we had extremely successful hunt. We killed more deer than they expected us to kill. And they went in after the hunt and they started looking for all these deer laying around the wood, deer laying around the woods, dead with arrows in them that they expected to find and they didn't find. I told you so. So then they gave us another park. And since then, we've been able to hunt those two parks here in Indiana with bow and arrow.
Nice. Yeah. I must confess that like, I will poo people that don't understand the history, but sometimes I forget how important it is to pass it on and not just, scoff at those that don't know it.
Those that don't know history are doomed to repeat history, right?
Yes. So, when you and I were talking, I feel like I'm pretty well versed in the history, Fred Bear and Glenn St. Charles and the guys that, around that era. But you started dropping names in like pre-1940 that I was like, never heard of them.
Yeah. And that's, I think, my passion really. There's so much information out there on Fred Bear, Howard Hill, Ben Pearson, deservedly so. And there's so much information at the beginning of our sport with the Thompson brothers and the Witchery of Archery, 1878. But all that period in between, from the time the Thompson brothers wrote that book, 1878, until Fred really got his marketing off the ground in the late 40s, early 50s, that period in between is kind of lost, the forgotten years, I call it. So my journey right now is to make sure that those guys, we're talking about some really important people there that have been forgotten to today's generation. Roy Case, Chief Will Compton, Chet Stevenson, Forrest Nagler, Roy Hoff, Doug Easton, Eastern Archery. All of that generation did so much to keep the sport alive. And between the book Witchery of Archery and Fred Bear's genius in his marketing, but they've been forgotten. And that's what I want to that's where I focus my attention. That's where I focus my collection. There's a lot of people that have a better collection than I do with bear archery. But if you look at what I've got in that forgotten years periods, that's where I think my fire really lights up.
Well, it's funny. You sent me those pictures today or yesterday, and it looks like an archery shop, like an older archery shop you just walk into at your house there. I was like, hey, maybe we should do this on scene. I mean, you got a cool thing there.
Yeah, I think you should. I think you should come out. Yeah, I built onto my house. I built 28 by 40 with 18-foot ceilings, and that's my man cave room. And it is, I've got sections of it dedicated to the 1800s archery. I've got sections dedicated to the early 1900s, and I got the 1920s. And I like, that I can walk through in my mind. I can walk through the evolution of our sport.
Wow.
And I can walk through all these periods of these different pioneers just by looking around the room. I can go from that corner 1870s. I can go to this corner 1900s. I can go to this corner 1930s, and I can just follow the journey right here in this room.
So for me, I don't consider myself very knowledgeable about those years. So for me, it was like, now the Thompson brothers, correct me if I'm wrong, they were hunting with a bow and arrow because they didn't have firearms. Is that correct? I mean, it was right after the Civil War.
And by the way, Indiana connection here again. Morris Thompson was born here in Indiana in 1844, but they moved to Georgia before the Civil War. And they actually enlisted and fought on the side of the South. And as they came back from the war, the soldiers, as they were being paroled, were not allowed to own firearms. They were on the side of the insurrection, so they weren't allowed to own firearms. Well, they'd always, since kids, played with a bow and arrow. Who as kids didn't play with a bow and arrow? And when they came back from the war, they got more and more serious about spending time with the bow and arrow. And in that period, in that 1860s, late 1860s period, there was no equipment being made here in the States. Any equipment that they wanted, that they didn't make themselves, just a stick and a string, they bought from England, and they had shipped over here some of the bows from the English bow makers. And that's when they went off and they went to the Everglades, and they spent time down in the Fish Eating Creek and the Everglades, and they wrote these articles and they sent them back up to the big periodicals of the day, Harper's Weekly and Scribner's and all those, magazines of the day, writing about their escapades hunting in North Georgia swamps or in the Everglades, hunting with a bow and arrow. And those articles were so popular that Scribner's convinced them, let us take some of those articles and let us reprint them and put them into book form. And they did that in 1878 and called it The Witchery of Archery. And that's where we really got our start. That's where people started, after the Civil War is the first time people in our country had enough free time to have a hobby, and they had enough expendable income to start looking for things to do for fun. And that's when bicycling got kicked off. That's when tennis got kicked off. And you go back and look at all the things that started in that same period. But none of them were big enough to really go on their own. So you look at some of the first art magazines, they were combinations of archery and bicycling or archery and tennis. And that's our roots. That's where we really got ourselves off the ground. And people for the first time started to think about, you know what, I'd like to hunt with a bow and arrow.
But it was born out of necessity, though, right? For the Thompson brothers.
Well, I would say not so much out of necessity at that time period. They weren't hunting to survive. They were hunting because they enjoyed being in nature. And if you read some of Morris Thompson's books, he wrote a lot of books. He didn't write just The Witchery of Archery. He wrote some fantastic natural history books, get back to nature books, Byways and Bird Notes, Sylvan Secrets. Some of those books that I think people even today would go back and read and discover how good of a writer he was. And you can read his words and you can feel him walking through the woods. You can hear the rain on the leaves from the way he writes. It's fantastic. His expertise with the use of words to bring you into the story. So, and those books can still be found out on eBay and some of the book sites for, $15-20. Sylvan Secrets, Byways and Bird Notes. They should rate right up there with some of the classics, Sand County Almanac by Leopold and some of the books that people talk about today. But go back and read some of the Thompson books. So now they were in it because they loved the outdoors. And the bow and arrow was their way of being in the outdoors and immersing themselves in Mother Nature.
Okay, so who comes next?
Well, there were a couple of people who were in that same period. And this is where it really gets fascinating for me, because this is all discovery and none of this is really written. Cliff Huntington down in Louisiana is probably one of the most knowledgeable guys who have spent literally years trying to research what was going on during these periods. And there's just not a lot of written information out there to find, but he's found a lot of it. And I'm finding some of it, but there were a couple of guys. There was one guy in Oregon. His name was F.S. Barnes. And what F.S. Barnes stands for, I have not been able to find. Even in the newspaper articles and such, when he signs his name F.S. Barnes. So, was it Frank, Fred? I don't know. People call him Friend Barnes. He was born in 1839. And he was trying to get archery clubs started. He was born in New York, but then he migrated over into the Minnesota area, and he was trying to get archery clubs started. And after the Civil War, he was a Union soldier in the Civil War, and he was trying to get clubs started in the St. Paul, Minneapolis area in the 1868 time period, and he just couldn't find enough people that he could get interested, so he kind of gave up on it, But here's a guy in 1868, when the Thompson brothers are off in the swamps living with a bow and arrow. Here's a guy who they don't even have a clue who each other are. Here's a guy in the Midwest trying to start archery clubs, and then he moves to Oregon. And he starts making U-bows in Oregon, and he learns from some of the English bow makers how to make English style D-section horn-knocked U-bows. And he becomes one of probably the finest bow makers in the world, living in Oregon. And then a gentleman by the name of Chief Will Compton hears of these bows being made by this gentleman up in Oregon by the name of Barnes. And Will Compton goes and mentors under Barnes. So you see the pieces start to come together, you know, all these little independent pieces of people working independently, not even knowing of each other. But then, you know, I pick up, there's this guy in Oregon making a bow. I'm going to go up there and I'm going to learn from him. So Compton learns how to make a bow from Barnes, an English style D-section horn-knock bow.
So what's the pipeline of information from this Barnes to English bow makers? I mean, is there anybody over here? Or, I mean, they're not on the internet.
You know, the first archery clubs, you know, these are not bow hunters. These are tournament archers, target archers. Started, you know, like the United Bowmen of Philadelphia in late 1820s. And they brought over English equipment, and they brought over the English style of target archery, York rounds and things like this. So there were a few people, a few clubs around the country who had perpetuated the English target archery, and Barnes knew of that, and he was able to connect the dots and be able to get some English equipment in his hands. But then, you know, that transformed. We're Americans. You know, we don't take anything and leave it the way it is. We take something and we're always trying to make a better mousetrap. So, you know, he's takes the English style bows, perfects making the English style bows, but then he starts, you know, thinking about hunting with the bow and arrow, and Compton starts thinking about hunting with the bow and arrow rather than just going out and shooting straw bales. So that evolution there. And then the Thompson brothers write the book, 1878, The Witchery of Archery. And now we start to get people thinking about not just target archery, but going into the woods with my free time that my fathers and grandfathers never even thought of having free time. And I have enough free time now to go into the woods and hunt with a bow and arrow. If I thought I needed to kill a deer to survive, to keep from starving to death, I would take a rifle. But no, I now have the time and the luxury to go out for the sport, the challenge of hunting with a bow and arrow.
Yeah, you know, I never dawned on me the thought of free time, not having free time, but you're absolutely right. I mean, it was a shift at some point from survival every moment of your day to free time. So when did the Wilhelm brothers show up?
Well, the Wilhelm brothers were in that 1930s, 1940s period. You know, the Howard Hill.
I thought they were a little earlier. Okay,
a little later. Yeah. Okay. So you know, I you know, for me, the segue there is, you know, let's go from Compton. So we've got Barnes, who teaches Compton. Now, Compton started life in Flint, Michigan, went to Nebraska, spent several years living with the Sioux in Nebraska, learned from the Sioux the Native American way of hunting with a bow and arrow and making Native American bows and arrows. But now he goes out to Oregon and learns the English style of making bows and arrows. And then he hears of this guy down in California by the name of Saxon Pope, who has this Indian friend named Ishi. And Compton goes down and wants to see Ishi, and therefore meets Pope. Now, Pope has an interest in archery and obviously has a huge interest in Ishi and learning from Ishi the Native American traditions. And here comes Compton, who teaches Pope how to make bows. Pope saw Ishi making Native American bows, but that's a far cry from what the English style longbows were. Compton actually made bows for Pope and for Ishi, and Ishi just couldn't comprehend that style of bow, right? His Native American style of hunting with bow and arrow was, a pretty crudely made bow, but I get really, really close to animals.
Yeah.
And the English, were able to shoot 60 and 80 yards at targets and hit them pretty regularly. So Compton comes in and teaches Pope, and Pope then becomes very interested in making fine equipment, fine archery equipment. Ishii dies, 1916. Pope writes this book about everything he'd learned from Ishii on the Native American style of hunting, the Native American style of arrows, etc. In 1923, this book is written. The hunt is called Hunting with the Bow and Arrow. That book caused more people to get into the sport than we probably give credit today. There was another gentleman by the name of Doug Easton. Doug Easton Doug Easton was, I think, like 15 years old and was in a hunting accident. There was a shotgun leaning up next to a car. They were rabbit hunting. The shotgun falls over, discharges, and hits Doug Easton in both legs. Doug Easton, as a 15-year-old boy, spends the next year in between hospitals and home recuperations, and a friend brings him over a book to read called Hunting with the Bow and Arrow. That is what sparked Doug Easton to start making archery equipment. And Easton, the early Easton bows, are some of the finest bows, bows you can imagine. What a craftsman he was. And then the Art Young connection there with Pope and Ishii and Compton, and then Art Young makes the movie about his hunting up in Alaska and goes around and showing the movie in the movie theaters. Then Fred Bear shows up in the audience. Fred Bear's fire gets lit and starts Bear Archery Company. So it's all those dots coming together there because of just a few people. Thompson Brothers writing a book in 1878. Friend Barnes teaching this gentleman by the name of Will Compton how to make fine archery equipment. Barnes dies. Compton loads up over 1,000 wood staves, moves to California, teaches Pope how to make fine archery equipment. Pope writes a book. Doug Easton reads the book. Fred Bear goes to a movie, and the explosion occurs from that.
It is amazing. It's like a fuse being lit all over the country.
It's like a family tree. If you go back and you do the genealogy and you take your extended family and you come back and it kind of comes to a point, that point where just a few people, and a few things could have gone a different way and history would have been different.
Now, Will Compton, did you mention he was in all the way across the country? Was he in Midwest all the way out to the west? Or
he was born in Flint, Michigan. In 1863.
I didn't.
And then as a young man moves to Nebraska, and then ends up in California.
I didn't realize that what the role, Compton traditional bow hunters. It's kind of an obscure character in the history, but what a pivotal piece, because information didn't travel very well. I got to imagine back at the turn of that century. So for him,
it did and it didn't. You'd be surprised. One of my best methods of research is newspapers.com. Now, obviously, the old magazines, Sylvan Archer and some of the magazines are wonderful. But even if you want to go even beyond that, go back earlier and earlier and earlier, the newspapers were the sources. And newspaper.com has archived many, many, many of the early 1800s, late 1800s, early 1900s newspapers. And you can subscribe to newspapers.com and you can put in a search for somebody like F.S. Barnes or Will Compton, and it'll bring you back unbelievable stories. I mean, if Aunt Judy was going to have a birthday party next week, it would be in the newspaper.
Yeah.
The level of detail that they put in the newspapers back in those days is amazing.
Yeah. Well, oh yes. In our local paper, and it's so cool when they do. Maybe other papers do. It's like 100 years ago today, or 75 years ago today. To read like what made the news, like, Dr. So-and-so took a drive, that was 40 miles, and it was news making,
Right. Everything that happened in the social circles made it to the newspaper. I was just reading a little bit ago, and another one of those early pioneers was Cassius Stiles, Captain Cassius Stiles. Fought in World War One. He was shot down 5 times. He was he was a pilot in World War One. Okay, well, what kind of bravery did it take to be a pilot in World War One in the first place? He was shot down 5 times during World War One. Won the Silver Star as a pilot in World War One. And the newspaper article was a couple of sentences about Cassius Stiles filed for divorce from his wife because his wife was spending too much time out of town or something like that. The gossip type things that were in the newspaper back in those days that you would never see today. But that's the kind of information you can find if you go out there looking deep enough.
There's 2 names that I want to see you expound on for me before I forget him. It's Art Laha. How do you say his last name?
Laha.
And then you mentioned him earlier, Chester Stevens. That is one of my favorite books. What's the name of that book?
The Old Bowhunter.
Yes, Ye Old Bowhunter.
The Old Bowhunter was the name of the book.
Oh, okay.
And it was edited by Nick Knott. So Chet was a really interesting guy. Chet was born 1883. And he didn't die until 1978, so he lived to be quite old. And he also lived long enough to be able to tell his stories to a lot of different people through a lot of different ways. So Chet, it's disputed. Now, if you read the Old Bowhunter book, Chet will say that he started bowhunting in the 1890s. And he has stories in there of hunting bear in the 1890s, hunting deer in the early 1900s, going on these long excursion hunts, camping trips, 1906. But there are other people that will dispute that, yes, he did those things, but he didn't necessarily do them with a bow and arrow. And he didn't start bow hunting until the early 30s. So it's kind of, gray, when did Chet really start? But what is undisputable is the legacy that he left. Once he started bow hunting, whether it was 1890 or it was 1930, doesn't really matter. He wrote so many articles in the bow hunting magazines, all the different bow hunting magazines under different names. Sometimes he'd write under his own name, sometimes he'd write under a pseudonym, but fantastic articles. And he was also a world-class photographer. So he documented a lot of his hunts and a lot of his campfires and a lot of his friends through his photography. And he was one of the pioneers in colorizing pictures. So some of his early photographs were black and white photography, but he had a method of colorizing them. And they're just beautiful art.
Yeah, it's been several years since I read that book, but that was kind of riveting, talking about getting on a train and riding a train in the middle of nowhere, getting off and spending, I don't remember, a week or something. It was just...
Yeah, you didn't just walk across the street and go bow hunting back in that time period, especially in Oregon, and that I think that's another angle that I like, that people many, many times think of Wisconsin, Michigan, some of the Midwestern states as being the birth of bow hunting, but no, you got to give credit to Oregon, Washington, California, even.
That's true.
Some of the early pioneers that were out there, like Chet Stevenson and like Will Compton and Doug Easton, coming from the West Coast, and those early organized bow hunts out there in Lobster Mountain, 1930, and Canyon Creek, 1935. Where they were opening up areas for the first time. And you could have hunted these areas before, but you were hunting with the gun hunters. but these guys were lobbying the state Fish and Wildlife agencies to open these areas up to bow hunting only. And the Canyon Creek hunt in Oregon there, starting in 1935, was one of those. And these guys were all the ones, the movers and shakers, were making that happen.
And it's amazing when you hear the rabid, I don't want to say lies, but the opposition to archery seasons then were just, like talking about hundreds of deer running around with arrows stuck in them. And I mean, they had an
just like I said,
battle.
1990, that's the same thing we were fighting in 1994 when we were trying to open the state parks to bow hunting here. But you'd be really interested in this. I have a pretty extensive collection of archery magazines going back to the very beginning. And one of those archery magazines, and I think it's National Bowhunter, maybe 1954, on the front cover is a letter from what was then the leading humane society organization in the country, congratulating bow hunters on being the most effective and most humane way to kill animals during hunting seasons.
That's awesome. That'll probably happen again today.
Well, if they would be honest, it would happen again today. But today, so they would never admit to it. And but it's right on the front cover. A letter from the leading humane society organization of the day, awesome. Thanking and congratulating bow hunters on being so humane.
Oh, that's good. So, what can you tell me about Art and why I find him fascinating? I don't remember the title of his book, but he spent some time right here in northern Idaho, and I guess that's where it really clicked with me.
Yeah. Well, Art was from Wisconsin. He was more in that 50s, 60s time frame, and his book, I'm going to walk over here and see if I can find his book.
Was it like, I want to say, I don't know.
Oh. Yeah, my archery book collection goes back into the 1600s. So sometimes when I try to find things, it takes me a little while to find things.
You got all that stuff insured, I hope?
Oh, yeah, well, let's not talk about that. But Art was what's the word I want to use for him? He was pretty
flamboyant.
Flamboyant's a good word. I like that word. Yeah, he was confident.
Yep.
He was very confident of himself, but very accomplished. A man that could back up his flamboyant ways. So he's one of the guys that I really wish I knew more about. I know Clark Gallup up in Wisconsin has quite a knowledge of Art, and that's one of those areas where I just really haven't dug enough into Art to really say that I'm an expert on his history.
Did you give up looking for the book?
Yeah, I did. I can't. There's just too much here.
Yeah. I can't remember the context, but it was over in Priest Lake, and I think he spent a couple years over there. And I want to say, gosh, maybe I'm thinking of something. Maybe I'm thinking of a different guy because he was working with some. He was working with some native guides up there or something, but that doesn't sound like the '60s. So maybe I'm thinking of somebody different.
Yeah, I'm gonna plead a little ignorance on Art.
How about
I can't find the book right now.
How about Roy Case?
Oh, Roy Case, yeah. He's another one that lived long enough that a lot of today's generation was able to get to know Roy, and his stories were able to be told firsthand, first person to a lot of people today. He didn't die until 1986. He was born in 1888.
Wow.
So he was bow hunting when the earliest Ye Sylvan Archer magazines were starting to be published in 1927. I have Roy Case's personal collection of Ye Sylvan Archer magazine. Wow. And they're bound by Roy. And throughout the whole series of Ye Sylvan Archer, 1927 until like 1953, he's got all his notes in there of his experience. I knew this guy. I hunted with this guy. This is the broadhead that I used on this and that. This is my first broadhead ever, 1927, the Kiska broadhead, all those personal notes in those magazines. But he took his first deer 1930 with a bow and arrow. And that's pretty impressive,
Wow. Yeah.
He's credited with taking the first licensed people that, earlier than that, you could kill a deer with a bow and arrow, but he was the first one to take deer with a bow and arrow under an archery license.
Oh, okay. And what so did you say what state that was? Did you already say that? I'm sorry.
Wisconsin.
Okay. Yeah, you talking about something that's newsworthy back then.
Yeah.
What other names? Like you've already said some names I didn't know. Like who else jumps out in that time?
One I'd like to bring up would be Aldo Leopold.
Okay.
Leopold was, back. I'm going to go back to my story there about when we opened the state parks up here in Indiana for hunting, and there was a big deal. That the animal rights people predictably would come and they were going to stop the hunts. They were going to block the roads with dump trucks to keep the hunters from coming in. And we, as the Indiana Bowhunters Association and other sporting organizations in the state of Indiana, set up a counter protest across the road from the animal rights people there on that first park hunt. And most of that park is about 30 minutes from Indiana University. So you can expect, there's a lot of young kids, a lot of liberal attitudes coming over there to protest the hunt. And after the newspapers had left and after the television trucks had left, yes, there was a lot of that. I went over and I just sat down in the middle with all those kids on the other side of the road. And I said, I really honestly want to understand why you object to this hunt, and everything they said was emotional, killing Bambi and all that. And I asked them, I said, do you ever hear of a gentleman by the name of Aldo Leopold? And they all said, yeah, we read his books in our classes. He's the father of conservation. Of course, yes, he is. I said, do you know he's a bow hunter? He was a bow hunter? And they were like, no, he wasn't. And I said, yeah, I've got Aldo Leopold's bow hunting equipment in my collection. He was absolutely a diehard bow hunter and loved it. And he was out of Wisconsin, and he died in 1948 from a heart attack. But he was born in 1887. He was a diehard bow hunter. And when you read his book, Sand County Almanac, or you read some of his other books about land ethics and all that, this is the guy who wrote the Bible of conservation, and he was a bow hunter.
How did they react? They accepted it?
They accepted it.
Wow.
And I've used that many, many times, with other people who come back and they, bow hunting's cruel and all this, and all. No, read, please. I ask you, and I've given copies to people. Read the Sand County Almanac. In that book, you're going to come across one statement that I think you need to consider. You, as the person telling me that I shouldn't be eating wild animals. In that book, he has a statement where he says his greatest fear, and this is 1948, his greatest fear is that someday people will think their meat came from the freezer and their heat came from the furnace.
Wow.
And how deep that was in 1948.
Profound. Yeah.
He didn't, that when you walk into the grocery store and buy a package of hamburger, you forget that a cow died. When you leave the room with the lights on, you forgot that a lump of coal had to be dug out of the ground to produce that electricity. And that's the time he feared that we would be so far removed from nature that we would no longer understand her.
Man, wow, that is profound. And it's it goes without saying. Like you walked over there and sat down and had a conversation. The unfortunate thing is today, in this climate today, you can't even have a conversation. You can't sit down and talk opposing views today. It's It's a shame.
Yeah, that's something I refuse. That you're right, but I refuse to accept that. Yeah. Whether it's a political argument, it's an ethical argument, or it's a hunting versus animal rights argument. I absolutely am going to be involved in that conversation. I'm going to instigate that conversation, because if we don't have that conversation, we're going to remain ignorant.
You're absolutely right, but it takes a temperament to have the conversation. Maybe I'm just looking at myself. I don't have the temperament to stand there and have somebody scream at me.
I worked for a French company, right? My company is based in Paris, France, and I love hunting. And the French don't understand hunting very well. And I love my old firearms too. And they don't understand guns. You American and your guns. And I say, you French and your wine. Your wine kills more people than my guns. Yeah. And I've had them come over here, and at the end of the conversation, I will challenge them. I say, you come and spend one afternoon with me. I'm going to take you to the range, and we're going to go shoot. And at the end of that afternoon, we're going to have this conversation again. Yeah. And every single time, they have come back and said, that's the most fun I've had in a long time.
Yeah, you Americans and your guns. That would be the reason why you're not speaking German there, Frenchie.
Every single time they say, at the end of the day, they say, I get it. I understand now.
Yeah.
So if you don't have those conversations, if you don't make those conversations happen, yes, you got to keep your emotions in check. Yes, you got to keep the conversation civil. We've lost the art to debate. We need to relearn the art to debate without being mad at each other. But if you can do that, you can get people to understand.
And you're absolutely right. I will say that my forte over the last 10 years or so has been created. I guess what I'm trying to say is I can have the discussion on predator management, wolf management. That's kind of my thing. So yeah, I'll walk that back a little bit, but it's difficult to have the any conversation today when it's just such a canceling, whoever has the loudest voice.
Well, the first thing you got to do is take the emotions out, right?
Yeah. So and that's what I tell people.
Yeah. If you can get them to drop their emotional feedback or their emotional responses. Now let's just talk black and white. Let's just talk data. Let's talk logic. And then you can really have a good debate.
Yeah.
And that's what we've lost. We've lost that art today, whether it be, the presidential election, or it be, the management of the wolf in Yellowstone Park, or reintroduction of wolf into Colorado. We've lost the art to be able to debate with each other without labeling the other side as the enemy.
Civility and respect.
Yeah.
So bouncing around here, did you, I saw an email about 5-6 days ago from the Pope and Young Museum, or Pope and Young Club, that the museum's going to close. Did you see that?
I read the same. I'm a senior member of Pope and Young. I got the same email. Now, maybe I read what I wanted to read, but what I read was they are selling the property, the building.
Yeah.
Yes, true. The museum and the contents were going to go to a retailer. Read between the lines who that is.
Yeah.
But they did not say they were selling the museum or closing the museum. They're moving the museum. This is what I read. Maybe, again, this is what I wanted to read. They're going to move it like the Archery Hall of Fame. It'll be in that retailer's location, but it'll still belong to the Pope and Young Club. It'll just be on their grounds, just like the Archery Hall of Fame. I hope that's what they're doing.
Yeah. I now I'm double kicking myself, because the year that PBS had the banquet over in Seattle, I was going to go to that banquet with the understanding that was the last year that Glenn's stuff was going to be in. Was that all of Pope and Young's museum, or is it just Glenn's stuff was going to be in Seattle, and then it was moving, and I never got there?
They're in Seattle. Glenn had his own museum, the St. Charles Museum. And then when Glenn got up in years and decided, I'm not going to be around forever, and sold his St. Charles Museum to the Pope and Young Club.
Okay.
So now it's called the Pope and Young / St. Charles Museum. But what is the Pope and Young Museum now was essentially the St. Charles Museum at one time. And that's what was in Seattle.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, I kicked myself. I did have the opportunity to meet Glenn St. Charles. My story was, well, you had mentioned your friends in Idaho, Ron and Susie
and Mike.
Yeah, Ron and Susie Shear. So Ron and Susie had one of Glenn's arrows he used a bodkin head. Is that right?
Well, Glenn he was around forever, so he used a lot of different heads. But I've got several of his arrows, and a lot of them have Mickey fins, which was a head that he made himself, or Thunderbolts, which was another head he made himself. I'm not saying he didn't, but he used a lot of different equipment over the years.
Yeah, I could be screwing it up. It might not. But anyways, they had donated one of his arrows. It was full length white dip, with his feathers and his fletching on it, and it was signed Glenn St. Charles. Well, it was kind of sad because it was an Idaho State Bowhunters Jamboree. There's 800 plus people there. Ron and Susie donate the arrow to be raffled off to raise money. And I looked at it and I'm like, I'm just doing backflips. I'm like, oh my gosh, I spent $10 on 50-cent tickets, and I think I was the only one that bought them. Like, it was sad that nobody really realized what was there. So I ended up winning the arrow, and I was just beside myself.
Well, good for you.
Yeah.
I mean, that is an example of how we've lost touch with our roots. That man, he's the one that took Fred Bear on the Little Delta hunt.
Oh,
right?
yeah. Yeah. It was his idea,
Delta
right?
Hunts were instigated by Fred or by Glenn.
But yeah.
And, so, but that's lost in today's world. The contributions that guy made were tremendous.
Yeah. Yeah. I think Fred gets a lot of credit. I don't think Glenn's name is out there and it could just bias on my part. I just think Glenn should get a little more credit than he does, or his name.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, probably just a name recognition. You got Bear Archery. That's probably what it is.
Well, Fred, Glenn didn't care so much about promoting himself. That wasn't what Glenn was about. Glenn was about promoting the sport of hunting with the bow and arrow. And there was another guy that I a more recent guy, but John Muzzy, and I have a hard time pronouncing his last name, but the guy that started Muzzy Broadheads.
Huh.
When I had my business, I'd set up at shows, and a lot of times, just coincidentally, for whatever reason, they always set me next to John in the Muzzy booth. And I got to know John, and I got to talk to John a lot. And he told me one time, we were just discussing the state of the sport of archery and bow hunting and how things were changing, maybe not for the best. And he said, there's a lot of people in the sport today who want to be something in archery, and we just don't have enough people who want to do something for archery.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. And I like that so much. And then when John passed away, I got a hold of Michelle, his daughter, and I said, could I get a picture of John? And she sent me a picture of John, and that's written on there. There are those in archery who want to be something in archery, and there are those in archery who want to do something for archery. And that was perfect, because that's what he told me in the booth.
That's in my lifetime, I've seen kind of a shift. Speaking exactly to that, and I had Fred Richter. Did I say his last name right?
Yeah, Fred Richter from West Virginia.
Yeah, I had him on, and I was really excited too because I'd seen his name through the years, and he is a guy that when you stop and think about, what we did, speaking personally, when you go to meetings, when you're president of the club, when you're giving your time, you're doing it because you love it. And some of that's lost. And you look at a guy and a list of things that Fred has done, Richter has done through the years, being involved in it. And we owe those guys a lot because
and they, you know what, and they never asked for any recognition, never once. Fred was president of the West Virginia Bow Hunters. He was president of PBS. He was, I think he was president of the National Bowhunter Education Foundation. He was on the board when I was on the board of National Bowhunter Education Foundation. Never once did you ever see Fred stand up and say, I need recognition, or do anything that drew attention to himself.
No, and there's I don't know, thousands of people like that, and I look at it as, for me personally, through the 80s and 90s is kind of when I was like keyed in, and I remember this stuff. But man, you're giving up time away from your family, from your job, it's money out of your pocket, but they did it because they believed in it. It was fun. It was camaraderie. It was a family. And yeah, we owe those people a bunch. And I don't see people stepping up these days. I had just a darn near shouting match with somebody today, and it was good. I mean, very good friends, but we had a disagreement on some stuff, and it's like, yeah, you're upset, but who goes to the meeting? Will you call the commission? Will you write a letter? Will you go before the commission and talk to them? I mean, it's one thing to pound your fist on a table and be upset, but what do you do to change things?
Yep. Well, that was Glenn St. Charles. That's the mold that Glenn St. Charles was made from. He was the guy that really wanted to do something for archery and bow hunting, and he didn't really care about being somebody in archery and bow hunting.
Yeah. Well, anybody else you want to bring up? Any other things were missed that you want to hit on?
Well, no, we could go through hours of people that deserve to be recognized. Roy Hoff, his archery magazine started back in 1944. As somebody that deserves credit and recognition for what he did. I think Floyd Eccleston, I'll just come back into, more recent generations. Floyd Eccleston out of Mount Pleasant, Michigan, really, truly one of the pioneers, and was one of Fred Bear's go-to guys. And Floyd just passed away not that long ago. I don't know, time flies now, maybe 10, 15 years ago. But a treasure trove of knowledge and information and history that Floyd Eccleston was. There's still people out there, and when I do my seminars and I do my talks about keeping the spirit alive, the thing I always like to close with is history is being made every day.
Yeah.
Tomorrow's history starts when you go to bed tonight, right? And don't lose sight of that. There are people still out there, Mark James, there are still people out there, Fred Asbell. There are still people out there that you can go talk to and you can sit down and you can have a campfire with today that are going to be thought of 20 years from now in the same light of Glenn St. Charles and Fred Bear and Ben Pearson. So don't think history was just yesterday.
So, Gene, I'm glad you brought that up, because I have on my notes here, I wanted to ask you, and I was going to forget, who do you think the legends are we have around us today?
Well, there's people that are still with us today that are going to be looked back on someday, in the not too distant future. We're going to look back and say these guys were really important to our history. But we were fortunate enough to call them friends, and in our era. And I look around at the people that I've had the chance to work with or get to know around a campfire or in a bowhunter education class over the years across the country, or hunting trips with different people or business trips with different people. And I think of people like Neil Bice down in Bear Archery, still with Bear Archery down in Florida. Neil, his father worked for Fred, and Neil was a young man working with Fred, and he's actually on the cover of the 1987 Bear Archery catalog, 87 or 84. I have to go back and look again. But that's Neil standing there with Fred, and Neil still works for Bear Archery down in Gainesville. And Joe White, also down in Gainesville, he's still around, and Joe White was vice president of marketing for Fred for many years, starting in 1976 or so until maybe 2000. those people have a lot of history and a lot of stories that directly link us back to what we might think of the golden years. Fred Bear and Glenn St. Charles, Ben Pearson and Howard Hill. And there's others. I want to bring up Cliff Huntington right now because Cliff happens to he's from Louisiana, and he's probably the number one archery bow hunting historian in the country. And I really respect Cliff. And he's fighting COVID right now. So I'd put out our prayers for Cliff and wish him well coming back from a pretty severe case of COVID. And I think, Carol Mock, Dick Mock's wife out in Nebraska, you got to throw the ladies in there because they were a big part of our history and a big part of the sport. Carol hunted with Dick, hunted with Fred right alongside, shared the same campfires. Norm Blaker out of Michigan. If you've got a chance to work with Norm or spend time with Norm, what a great guy. And I think one last one I'll bring up, Will Jimeno out of New York. I don't know if you know Will's story, but he was a Port Authority police officer on 9/11. And he actually was in the towers when the towers fell.
Wow.
Serious bow hunter. And he was going to go bow hunting, but he got called that morning to go work. The towers came down on him and his squad. And there's a movie, World Trade Center, with Nicolas Cage. It's all about Will and his squad and his sergeant. His sergeant and Will were the only two pulled alive.
Wow.
From the rubble of the towers. And I get emotional thinking about that story. And Will's a great friend.
Now,
serious bow hunter.
Yeah, and I absolutely recognize Will's name. And, I remember reading about him as a bow hunter and, his part in in saving and helping people there that day on September 11th. But I guess I didn't realize he was a historian, though. Absolutely didn't know that.
Well, he's not so much a historian as he is, he's a caretaker of our sport, our heritage. He's just one of those people I call the bridge between the old and the new. And he's going to be one of those guys that we look back on. You get a chance, if you're a part of a state bow hunting organization or any kind of an organization, invite Will to come speak at your banquet and listen to him tell the story first person of 9/11 and what happened, and his reverence for our country and his reverence for the freedoms we have and our ability to do what we love, to hunt with a bow and arrow. And the hair will stand on the back of your neck as he's telling the first person story of being inside the building as it's falling around him. I just can't describe how that will make you feel.
Bet that'd put an apple in your throat. Dang. Cliff Huntington, that was another name that I recognize through the early days of Trad Gang. And yeah, anytime he was on a thread, it was interesting. So I'm glad you threw his name out there.
And you got so many people out there. Wade Phillips in Nebraska, another one, just, got a tremendous amount of knowledge. Joe and Jay St. Charles and the St. Charles family, we're still surrounded by a lot of people that we can look back on and should look back on and will look back on and say, you know what, I'm glad I got to know those people. Maybe you didn't get the chance to meet Fred Bear, but now these people are still here. You have the chance to meet these people, get to know them, become friends with them, maybe even share a campfire with them.
And I think we talked off air at one point. Now, before I forget, the guy in Oregon, you said his name. It did not ring a bell, but can you say his name again?
Dave Doran, maybe?
No, it was dang.
Chet Stevenson.
No, you just said it a minute ago. Hey, I'll think about it here in a second. Off air we were talking about legends and stuff, and we put them in certain categories. That's only natural. They're remembered for certain things. I think you and I talked about Mike Schlegel. Now, Mike might not be known to a ton of people, but again, his his contribution throughout the years on a national level, serving with the Pope and Young and stuff. But for me, on a local level, on a state level, he's an icon in Idaho, and I wish more people would know his work for wildlife, not just for bow hunting, but for wildlife.
Mike's been so active in so many things over the years, with Pope and Young and state organizations. But there in the state, he was the elk biologist for many years, and then he was in conservation law enforcement for many years, and just as humble a man as you'll ever meet. And you're right, he's one of those guys that I call a friend, and I get to go see Mike every now and then and spend time with him, and just a peach of a guy.
Again, off air, you were telling me, this was funny, actually. You were telling me about Glenn St. Charles calling you, and you're in the Midwest, and he's over in Washington.
I got to know Glenn fairly well, through Joe and Jay. And, I was collecting, and Joe was obviously a big collector, and Joe was running the St. Charles Museum before they sold that museum to the Pope and Young Club. But anyhow, so I got to know Glenn fairly well, and I live in Indiana. I'm sitting around probably a Monday evening. This is back many years ago, and the phone rang, and I picked up the phone, and it was Glenn. And so, how are you doing, Glenn? And he said, what are you doing Friday night? He was just, Glenn was kind of a straight to the point kind of guy, right? He didn't beat around the bush a lot. I said, I don't know, Glenn, what are we doing Friday night? Obviously, you've got something planned. He lives in Seattle. I'm in Indiana. What are we going to do Friday night, Glenn? He said, well, here's how it's going to happen. You're going to pick me up at the airport 6:00 Friday night in Indianapolis, and we're going to drive over to Cincinnati. He says, you got a van, right? I said, yeah, I've got an old GMC Safari van. He said, well, you're going to take all the seats out of it. And I said, okay. And then what are we going to do? He says, we're going over to this old guy's house in Cincinnati. Charlie Pearson, he was a bow hunter, and he and his father ran E. Bud Pearson Archery from the 30s all the way up to like 1976. And he said, Charlie's got a lot of history, and he's got a lot of memorabilia, and we're going to go over and see Charlie. And so I said, okay. So I picked up Glenn, 6:00 Friday night, and Joe was with him, and I had all the seats out of the van, and we went over and we spent the day with Charlie and Mildred there in Cincinnati. And it was one of those times where I actually did things right. And I remembered, you know what, I should take my video recorder and really? I should take my tripod. And I set that up. And while Joe and I were going through all this memorabilia, unbelievable memorabilia that Charlie had, he never threw anything away. Letters, invoices, everything he kept. And we're going through all this stuff, and I just set the video camera up over in the corner and on the tripod and turned it on and recorded. And Charlie and Glenn, who's two guys that are at that time probably 87, 88 years old, and they were just talking all day long about the old days.
Oh my gosh.
And how things were, and the people and the stories. And I've still got that video, and I'm going to put that in digital form, and I'm going to put that out probably on my archery collecting blog or YouTube channel. And I'm just for people to enjoy, because it was so much fun just to sit there and listen to them tell stories about the old days.
No doubt. Man, that's a good call for sure. Wow. So you ended up with a van load of stuff? Did that go?
There was so much stuff. If he hadn't have told me to take the seats out of that van, we came out of there and I couldn't have put another arrow in that van. We had things going back into the 1800s. Joe and I are sorting through arrows and broadheads, and I got this on video. And they were the first commercially made broadhead ever made in the United States was called the Peck and Schneider. And it was 1879. It was right after the Witchery of Archery book by the Thompson brothers. And, it only took about a year for the commercial guys to realize, hey, there's a market out here. Bow hunting's starting to take off because of this book. Maybe we should start to make and sell equipment. So Peck and Schneider was kind of the Sears and Roebuck of the day. They had a big catalog. You could buy everything in it. And they had a sporting goods section, and they came out with a broadhead called the Peck and Schneider broadhead on the Will Thompson arrow. It was in their catalog, 1879, but nobody had ever found one. And Joe and I are sitting there, and we're sorting through old arrows, and we're sorting through broadheads, and we had a rhythms set up. We had a big table set up, and we'd put the common stuff in this pile, the pretty good stuff in this pile, and the pretty scarce stuff in this pile, and the rare stuff in this pile. And then over on the far left, we had the oh my God pile.
the shrine.
and we're going through these arrows and sorting them into the different piles. And I noticed Joe pick up this arrow, and he looks at this arrow, and he just kind of stares at this arrow, and he starts to move it over to the far left of the table. And he picks it up and he looks at it again. And then he lays it over on the oh my God pile. And he goes and sorts another couple of arrows. And then finally he just stops and he reaches back over and picks that arrow up again. And he looks at me and he says, "Do you know what this is?" And I said, "No, Joe, tell me what this is." And he said, "This is the Peck and Schneider broadhead, and it's on the arrow. This is on the Will Schneider or the Will Thompson arrow."
Oh my gosh.
And this is the only one that's ever been found. I've got that recorded on video, right? And it wasn't 10 minutes later we found the second one.
Wow. Did you say it's Peck and Schneider?
Peck, P-E-C-K, yeah. Peck and Schneider. Just S-N-Y-D-E-R.
That's pretty cool. Man, I would love to see that video. I mean, how long is it?
Oh, yeah. It's quite long.
Yeah, I imagine.
Get the video up and then let it run, all day while we were sorting. So I'm gonna have to, after I get it back, I'm gonna have to edit it out because just a lot of this stuff probably is pretty redundant. But
yeah,
there'll be some of the stories that are Glenn and Charlie are telling that we need to preserve and get out there for people to share. And those moments of discovery, like finding that Peck and Schneider broadhead on that Will Thompson arrow, those need to be shared. So I'll edit it and get it out there.
Yeah. I'm sure we could get some professional editing assistance if you wanted it. That's pretty special.
That would be fantastic.
Yeah. I'll work on that. Another name I want to throw out there, and this one's close to my heart. Not that I've ever met him. Actually, I did meet him. With this resurgence of traditional archery, and it's great. The younger crowd is a little bit more technical, and everybody's gap shooting, string walking. That's fine. Fred Asbell, to me, and this is just through my eyes, Fred Asbell, to me, he kind of kept traditional archery alive when it was on life support. And he's an instinctive shooter. He wrote a couple books, and it kind of, to me, it kept things alive. He was still shooting stickbows when everybody was burning them. And today, he's, whether or not it's true, people will point to instinctive shooting and, problems with target panic. And I don't think that he gets the credit that he's due. I've tried to get him on the podcast before. I don't know. He's not a very responsive guy. So I'll just leave it at that.
Well, you talk about humble. Fred's pretty humble. But he's. I couldn't agree more with what you said. He's another Hoosier, by the way. I got to, throw that little plug in there. He was a big part of starting the Indiana Bowhunters Association back in 1965 when the Indiana Bowhunters Association was getting started. Fred was right at the front of getting that underway, and he was also a big part of the Deer Creek Archers up at Greencastle, Cloverdale area, and the Cloverdale Traditional Nationals and all that. That club there. He was a big part of that club. So here in Indiana, he had a big hand in getting bow hunting started, and the impact that he made during that time. Glenn St. Charles again was telling me about times when the traditional equipment had become so unpopular and the compounds were taking over. This would have been late 70s. They were actually burning recurves in the fireplace, for heat. And they were cutting them up and throwing them away because they couldn't sell them. And here comes along Fred, and he's with Bob Pitt again, another friend of his up there in Greencastle. And they're keeping this traditional spirit alive, and they're starting the company Bighorn Bow Hunting, and they're out there shooting recurves, and they're going up to Alaska and doing it the hard way, the real hard way, driving up to Alaska, and they're
in that green Chevy Scout or something.
Yeah.
Not a Chevy Scout, International Scout.
Yeah, right. and they were blazing the trail, and not really understanding how important they were going to be to us, but they were keeping it alive when everybody else had given up on it. And yes, they deserve the credit. Both Fred and Bob deserve the credit for keeping that thing going.
Yeah.
When everybody else was changing ships.
Yeah, that was like the 80s. I would just I'm thinking that would have been like mid 80s into the mid 90s. Seems like it would have been it was on life support.
Yeah, if you go back and you look, I've got a full collection of Bowhunter magazines going back to the first one in 1971, September, October. And by the way, it's their 50th anniversary this year of Bowhunter magazines. So look for that 50th anniversary issue. I'm going to write an article in there about the history of magazines and the importance of magazines in our sport for that 50th anniversary edition. But that whole era there, from the late 60s when the compound was first patented through the early 70s when Tom Jennings was perfecting it enough to bring it out commercially. But you really don't see a lot of compounds in the magazines until 73, 74. Then you start to see the transition really moving from traditional equipment to compounds. About that 74 period, you start to see now there's more compounds than there are traditional. And then after that, obviously, it just, gained momentum and picked up speed through the late 70s and into the 80s.
Let's see. I had a few other names written down and a few other notes. Now, off the wall question. Do you ever have a beer with Fred Bear?
Oh, yeah. Fred, I was a Fred Bear. I was a dealer for Fred here in Columbus, Indiana, back in early 80s, mid 80s. And got to know Fred, got to meet Fred several times. But one time in particular, the SHOT Show, this is back before the Bowhunting Show or the ATA show came out. And the SHOT Show was where all the dealers went to buy all your equipment, order all your equipment for your year, whether it be guns or ammunition or boots or clothes or bows and arrows. Everything was in one place called the SHOT Show then. So in 1986, the SHOT Show was in New Orleans, and I went down, and I was walking down Bourbon Street and just, enjoying New Orleans. And Fred Bear I knew Fred was having a party for his dealers, his big dealers, not little guys like me. I'm really little Bear archery dealer at that time. I'm walking down Bourbon Street and I see my rep, and he said, "Hey, you want to go to the Bear party with me tonight?" And I said, "I can't go to the Bear party. I'm in blue jeans and tennis shoes and a t-shirt, and I didn't bring a suit and tie, and that's what that party's kind of, for the big guys and the money guys, and I'm not one of them." And he said, no problem. He said, "As long as you've got this pass, they'll let you in." So I said, "Sure, I'll go." So I go down and I find this beautiful open air courtyard hotel where they were having the Fred Bear party for all their big dealers and distributors. And I walk in and I'm in my blue jeans, tennis shoes and t-shirts, and everybody else is in suits and ties. And I just kind of, I get there's flat bottom boats, and there's shrimp, and there's crawdads, and there's flat bottom boats full of ice down beer. And it's a big deal. It's kind of a nice setting, but I'm so out of place. I go over and I get a plate of food and I get me a cold beer, and I walk to the back of the room, and then I try to find a table as far away from anybody as I can get because, I'm out of my element.
I've been to those parties. It was you.
Yeah. And I'm sitting there and I'm eating my crawdads and, eating my shrimp and drinking my cold beer. And the shadow comes over me, and I turn around, and this long, lanky gentleman standing there, it's Fred Bear. He's standing right there looking down at me, and he's got a cold beer in one hand, and he's got his oxygen carton mask in the other hand, and he looks over at me and he says, "I'm glad I ain't paying for this anymore."
That's good.
And then he sits down, and we sat there, and we drank a cold beer, and we ate some crawdads and shrimp, and we talked for a little while, and it was just an amazing. That was Fred, though. He associated with the common man. And here was all these people are spending a whole lot more money than me in his business, but he came over and sat with me.
Oh, that's awesome. Let me guess.
That's who Fred was.
Yeah. Let me guess. He was drinking either a craft beer or IPA.
It was a Budweiser. Okay. So, he wasn't perfect.
Oh, that's awesome. I don't know if I mentioned it earlier, but I have a friend that spent a little bit of time with Fred Bear in a hotel room. Him and a couple of buddies happened to run into him, and I might have mentioned it earlier, so I won't go into it. But yeah, he said it was just unbelievable, and he was a chain smoker. So
he was a chain smoker, and you can talk to anybody that got to meet Fred or got to know Fred, and they'll tell you the same kinds of stories about how common he was and how humble he was, and that's great sense of humor that he had.
So let me see what other names are going to jump out at me. The legends that we have today are friends. Somebody the other day mentioned somebody and said they were a legend, and I said, well, I won't say his name. I said, no, I don't think he's not a legend yet. And they fired back. And I think there was, you try not to read into somebody's comments too much, but I think they were a little irritated. I said, well, why isn't he a legend today? I said, I kind of figure if somebody can kick my butt, they're not old enough to be a legend.
Well, there's a lot of people that are trying to be legends.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. That back to the John, the guy that started Muzzy Archery's story, that there are those people who want to do something for archery, and there are people who want to be something in archery. And that's what I look at. Are you trying to be somebody in archery? Are you trying to be the next Fred Bear? You're not going to do it. There will never be another Fred Bear. But are you trying to do something for archery? And that's the people that I really tend to gravitate toward, the Cliff Huntingtons and the Norm Blakers and the Neil Biases and the Joe Whites and the Will Jimenos, those people who are trying to do something to make our sport better, to attract more people into our sport, to keep our spirit alive. That's the kind of person that I really respect. And those people who are trying to be somebody in archery, they just got to turn me off,
Yeah. And there's young people that, that you'll see a lot of times they'll be asking questions. How do I get in the outdoor industry? How do I get in the outdoor industry? There's some wisdom that comes with age, and they might figure it out someday, but there are people, like you say, that are just giving back because they feel it's right. And you hope that the younger generation kind of figures that out someday.
Yeah. I think they will. I think, we have talked in the past about how sport seems to be doing pretty well. We're pretty healthy right now.
Yeah.
If you look around, yes, there are a lot of young people that are struggling. There are a lot of young people that are spending too much time, in front of video games, or never get the chance to go out and get mud on their boots. But yeah, we're not doing too bad. There's a lot of people coming into our sport. There's a lot of people that are getting introduced to our sport through the archery in the schools programs, which are just amazingly popular. Tens of thousands of people introduced to the bow and arrow through the archery in the schools program. And how many of those will end up hunting with a bow and arrow? Probably quite a few. Not all of them, but quite a few. So it's a pretty healthy place to be. And we just got to have people that can help mentor them, and help guide them, and be there for them when they have questions for us, just like Glenn and Fred Asbill and those people did for us.
Yeah. Two things I'll say to that. Number one, hats off to Compton's for their work with getting bows into young people's hands. And to your point, they may not all bow hunt, but someday they might be voting about an archery season. And you want an educated voter for sure.
That's exactly right. If they just get a bow and arrow in their hand, or they get a chance to eat a venison chop, or, venison kebabs, which I like to cook whenever I go to places where I'm going to be with non-hunting people. I'll take a lot of times. I'll take the barbecue grill, and I'll take some kebabs, and I'll get their hands on some venison kebabs or some caribou kebabs, or whatever the case may be. Something easy to fix, and generally everybody likes that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And they taste that and they say, "Oh my gosh, I didn't realize it would be this good." And I say, "Well, yeah, it's you see, that's one of the reasons we like to hunt."
Yeah. I had no idea Bambi tasted so good.
And someday, if they ever comes down to the point where they have a ballot initiative to do or not to do what we love, then they'll be on our side.
Yeah, and I feel like what I do at the podcast and the social media platform and everything that I hear and see, there's some fringes that within traditional archery that are, never going to be happy. But overall, we are in such a good place right now. I think that, it's a bright future. I really, really sincerely believe that.
Well, Glenn was, St. Charles again. I talk to Glenn all the time because he was really, truly one of my heroes, not just a friend, but he was a hero from the time I was a little boy until he got to be a friend later in life. And he always said, we've got to show them how much fun we're having. We got to show them how much fun it is to go into he called it walk in the woods. And you can't force people to do something. You have to make them want to do something. And if they see you having a good time, they're going to want some of that action themselves. So
I think
that's the way we have to approach this.
Yeah. And that's profound because I think that is I was actually just writing a piece for Compton, and that's exactly my point is that, we haven't been browbeating them or, from my angle for the people that I deal with, we haven't been browbeating people for the last, almost 3 years. They're coming because they see how much fun it is. They see the challenge, and it's become cool, like I said earlier.
Yeah. Yeah. If you go up to Berrien Springs there at the Compton Shoot and you see people camping and you see the families and the young kids are out there playing and they're going out and shooting their bow and arrow and they're coming back and they're laughing and, high-fiving each other. And it's, it's a spirit of fun. It's, you don't see people coming back frustrated because they didn't shoot a good score. You see people coming back and laughing about how you missed the target. Well, that's the way we've got to love them into the sport.
Yeah. Man, it's been so enjoyable. We're going to make this a regular deal. I'm not sure what we're going to do, but we'll work something out. So I really appreciate your time. Enjoy talking to you. What website? Put a plug out there for your website, Facebook page.
I've got archerycollecting.com as a website, and I have to admit I haven't kept it up as much as I want to, but there's some good information out there on archerycollecting.com on how to get started in collecting books, broadheads, and different kinds of bear archery memorabilia. This really, it's a good place to go to get some, if you don't know anything about, maybe I'd like to get into history, archery history, or maybe I think, I may even get into collecting. There's some really good information out there on that site. There's also my blog I've got on Facebook called Archery Collecting. And there's several blogs out there on Facebook, and there's several groups out there on Facebook about the history. There's one called Archery History and Collectors Campfire. But go out to Facebook and just type in search for archery history or archery collecting. Get into those groups and just start making friends, start making connections, building a network. Hey, I'm new to this, and you'll be surprised at how people will take you under their wing and share with you. And, that's a great way to get started.
Yeah. Even if you're not interested in, collecting, just knowing the history is fascinating. When it's wintertime, you're reading something or, you just harken back to, same weapon you got in your hands today. Maybe your clothing's a little different, they're to leather boots and wool, and we got some high tech stuff, but just the pursuit of game with a simple stick and string.
I heard recently something I thought was profound, and I'm gonna kind of steal it. If it hadn't been for Art Young, there wouldn't have been Fred Bear, and if wasn't for Fred Bear, then there wouldn't have been Fred Asbell, and if there wasn't Fred Asbell, there might not have been a Gene Hopkins. And it's that chain.
That's awesome.
That history. Yeah, and you just take that all the way back. If there hadn't been Morris Thompson writing The Witchery of Archery, there wouldn't have been W.S. Barnes or F.S. Barnes. And if there wasn't F.S. Barnes, there wouldn't have been Chief Compton. If there wasn't Chief Compton, there wouldn't have been, Saxton Pope. If Saxton Pope hadn't have been there, there wouldn't have been, it's that continuation that we have to think about going forward too, not just backward, but going forward. And if there wasn't a Cliff Huntington or a Norm Blake or a Will Jimeno, then the next guy wouldn't maybe pick up the baton. He wouldn't have the fire that we have. So, think about that. What are you doing? What are you doing to help preserve the chain and keep the spirit moving forward? So the next guys can come in and have just as great a time as we've had.
Thank you for what you do, preserving this stuff. That's awesome. Preserving it for the next generations.
It's important. I really enjoy it. But I do feel that obligation in a good way. It's something that they did for us and we need to do, and we need to keep the spirit alive. That's what it's all about.
Right on. We'll leave it at that. Thanks for visiting with me, Gene.
You're welcome. Thanks for the opportunity.
All right. Take care.